I'm Steve Kendall. Much of the focus in the news has been on the presidential election and the COVID-19 pandemic. There are other issues going on in Columbus being addressed by the legislature and the governor. Here to get us caught up on those, you'll know her as the host of The State of Ohio, which airs on WBGU-PBS every Sunday at noon, is Karen Kasler. Karen, thank you for being here today with us on The Journal.
Hey, it's great to talk to you. Thanks.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned the governor and the legislature, and one of the things that seems to be going on, and it has been especially prior to the pandemic, but especially now since the pandemic, it seems as if the governor and the legislature, both the legislature controlled by Republicans, the governor a Republican, they seem to disagree as much as they agree on things. And I guess, could you talk about that dynamic a little bit down there? Because sitting up here in Northwest Ohio, it seems like he's arguing more with them than he is with the Democrats who are in Columbus, which is sort of unusual.
It really is, because when DeWine took office, there had been this relationship that the legislature had with former Governor John Kasich that had started to get really confrontational. There was a lot of pushback that lawmakers were giving Kasich on things like renewable energy, green energy standards, and things like this. And so when DeWine came into office, there was a lot of talk about how this was going to be a different relationship, a much more positive working relationship between the legislative branch and the executive branch. Well, here we are in the pandemic, and that's changed because you've got a certain segment of the legislature and that has really been pushing back on DeWine's actions that he's taken on COVID-19. And that's a big change from even where we were in March and April when the governor first issued the original shutdown, closed schools, all that. And for a while, that was something that it seemed like everybody was on board with. But there was still this element, I think, starting out early on, of lawmakers who were very concerned about the effect that was going to have on businesses. So we started to see the whole Open Ohio movement forming and protests at the Statehouse from people who were concerned about how these policies, these shutdowns, these lockdowns were affecting businesses. And now we're at a full-fledged impasse in some areas between certain members of the legislature, certain very conservative Republican members of the legislature who don't like these policies, who don't like the mask mandate, who don't like the COVID-19 protocols. They want all these rules removed, and they think that the governor has overstepped his authority in doing this. Meanwhile, you've got DeWine, who says he's working off science and what the best practices he's seen, both from what's happening in the state, but also nationwide. And there's this pushback. And so you get these bills now. There's been articles of impeachment that have been filed,
right?
Which is just a very small group of, there's 4 lawmakers involved in that one. We could talk about that if you want, but also a couple of bills that would specifically make sure, according to lawmakers, that the legislature has a role in determining what the policy is on these public health orders.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because I was going to talk about the fact that, yes, it's really unusual to see, again, a legislature of the same party as a governor talking about, and again, it's a handful of legislators, but it does make the news when they're talking about, we need to impeach the governor. And I think that a lot of people find it interesting that Governor DeWine, who is a Republican, has never been considered to be a left of center Republican, if there is such a thing. He's not conservative enough for the legislature, and I think if anybody suggested that in the past, you would have said, well, that's just crazy. He's a true Republican, as Republican as you can get, and yet not Republican enough for some folks in the legislature, and impeachment is just one of the things, as you mentioned.
Yeah, when you look at DeWine's past, I mean, you look at his support for, he identifies strongly as pro-life. He's been very supportive on some of these hardcore, rock bottom conservative issues. And yet he's always had this idea in the last, 15 years or so that he's not Republican enough for some people. And I mean, even when he was running for Attorney General, there was a movement to try to put somebody up against him because he was too willing to compromise with Democrats, according to some people in the Republican Party. And so that's really carried over now into this pandemic, when you have even not so right-wing Republican legislators who are saying that DeWine has gone a little bit too far in his authority on these public health orders. I mean, Republicans have overwhelmingly supported these bills that would try to push back on his authority to issue these orders, saying in their view, they want to play a bigger role. They feel that the governor, in his executive authority, has gone way too far in what he thinks he can do. Now, of course, the governor has said, I am the executive. I appoint the health director. I have the ability to do these things. And there's also the question of, if the legislature did play a role, how would that happen when you start talking about things that need to be done quickly? I mean, a public health order goes into place, and then all of a sudden, 24, 48 hours later, that order is throughout the state. Well, the legislature doesn't usually respond that quickly to things.
Right, exactly, because, and you make that a very good point, that these things are, we get to that situation of, okay, what are the executive's role here and what is the legislative role? And it's obvious the way the Constitution is currently being interpreted that the governor feels he has this authority to do this through the health department, some other things. And in fact, some of the pushback from the legislature probably led to Dr. Acton leaving her role as the head of the state's health department because of that constant, it seemed, reaction to health orders being done either by governor executive order or through the health department. Is there, do we see this stopping anytime soon? I mean, I know we're in a lame duck session right now, but it seems as if it's getting stronger versus more, there's less cooperation than maybe there was, as you said, even just a few months ago.
Well, there have been two bills that have been passed recently that DeWine has said very publicly that he has concerns about. One he's already vetoed. They both relate to his ability to put in public health orders that would affect all businesses and require them to shut down. And so he's said that this really hits his ability to try to do what he's doing here in the pandemic in terms of keeping people apart, keeping things shut down. Now, granted, we aren't in a shutdown right now. I mean, most businesses are open, though there are COVID-19 protocols in place. I mean, the mask mandate, when you're in a business, you're supposed to be wearing a mask,
right?
Which is interesting because even here at the Statehouse, while there was a sign indicating that everybody who comes into the Statehouse wears a mask, and certainly most of the people who are here are wearing masks, the legislature is a separate branch of government, and that rule does not apply to them, and they have chosen not to apply that to them. The House actually had a vote a couple of weeks ago about whether they should be required to wear masks, and it was voted down. That was a motion that was going to be binding on all members of the House. The Senate has its own rules. Right. And so, I think that this will continue probably through the end of this pandemic, because there are going to be orders that especially right-wing Republican legislators really have a problem with. And some Democrats have even joined in and said they had a problem with some of these rules. For instance, a bill that would allow for businesses to stay open and be considered essential as long as they could follow COVID-19 protocols. And that's one of the bills that DeWine said he had a concern about because it was going to potentially slow down what he was trying to do. But, Democrats are hearing from their own constituents as well, saying these shutdowns that don't affect Amazon, they don't affect Walmart, they don't affect the big grocery stores, but they do affect small businesses that sometimes sell the same things as those major retailers do. And so it's just a constant struggle here, I think, over that whole economic issue. And this is potentially not going to end even after the pandemic is over. Whether these bills will continue, we'll be in a new legislative session, and so these bills would have to start all over again that haven't passed. But I can imagine that some of this could even come to the Ohio Supreme Court to determine who actually has the authority here. What does the Constitution say about public health orders, with the governor saying one thing and the legislature saying, hey, we want to weigh in on that?
Yeah. Now, when we come back, let's talk a little bit more about that and some of the other things that the governor has tried to do and the legislature has tried to do, and the two of them haven't been able to find a central point where they can all agree on. So we'll be back in just a moment with Karen Kasler here on The Journal on WBGU. Thank you for staying with us here on The Journal. Our guest is Karen Kasler. You see her every Sunday. She's the host of The State of Ohio, which is seen at noon each week here on WBGU-PBS. And we were talking in the first segment about the fact that the governor and the legislature of the same party, and you talked in pretty good detail about the way they're disagreeing on things. One of the things the governor, and I know we touched on this a little bit prior in a way, one of the things the governor has done is tried to move something through with an anti-violence gun proposal. And we know that that's always a delicate thing. But it's one of many things that has gotten pushback or less than fast action, shall we say, from the legislature. I think that bill's sitting in a committee someplace, and so far as there's no indication that's going to see the light of day. But that's just another example of something that the governor has tried to work through the legislature that isn't COVID related, finally, but he's even having difficulty with that.
Yeah, when he started out as governor in 2019, you might recall, and this feels like a million years ago, but it was only last year,
right,
where there was a crisis at ODOT, the Ohio Department of Transportation, and there was going to be a need to raise the gas tax. And so there was a struggle back and forth because he wanted to raise the tax by a certain point, and lawmakers have been very anti-tax here. Republican lawmakers who control the legislature, they have supermajorities in both the House and Senate. They did not want to go through with this. There was a compromise that managed to be developed here. And that was the first victory, I think, that DeWine really could claim, but it certainly showed that there was going to be, it wasn't going to be just rolling out the red carpet for DeWine. Exactly. Sure. And so this particular piece of gun legislation, which he calls Strong Ohio, it came together right after the shootings in Dayton. And he had at first said that he wanted to have mandatory background checks, which is something that Democrats have wanted for a long time. Well, that did not happen in his final proposal. It came up with a system for which people who are selling guns privately could come up with a background check through their sheriff's offices. It came up with a new way to do the pink slip law, which deals with people in mental institutions, people who are suffering from mental illness, who are potentially addicted to drugs and alcohol, and their access to firearms. And he had said that he had worked with the major gun rights groups to try to get something together that could be palatable for lawmakers to pass. Well, apparently that's not what happened. And certainly the pandemic pushed some of this aside. But this bill really didn't seem to have a whole lot of momentum, even from the very beginning. Democrats say it's not enough, and Republicans say they're very concerned about what this might do with regard to gun rights. I mean, this is a legislature that has consistently expanded gun rights over the last 10, 15 years. So this was viewed as something that would pull back on that. And that's not something that many lawmakers, especially from rural areas, wanted to see happen.
Right. And one of the things, too, somewhere buried in a lot of the things going on, I know there is another bill that talks about changing Ohio's stand your ground law, which sort of dovetails into the fact that the governor was trying to move in one direction. That almost opens things up, it seems, going the other way a little bit, makes it easier, or tried to clarify in some way how you could defend yourself and when. And the perception was that it made it a lot easier to use a gun as a defensive weapon than it is right now, currently, the way the state laws are written. So again, sort of that same disconnect of two sides pushing back and forth against each other just when it comes to guns. Another thing that, at least from sitting outside of Columbus, that seems to have gotten positive reviews and a lot of support, at least what we see locally, is the school funding bill. But is what we're seeing, does it look as positive down there as it seems to be outside of Columbus, or not?
Well, certainly it was a positive reception that this bill got. I mean, when it was first introduced, it had actually been talked about last spring, so 2019, and there were a series of discussions around the state where the sponsors, then Representative Bob Cupp from Lima, and Representative John Patterson from Northeast Ohio, so a Republican and a Democrat, had put this thing together. It had taken about 5 years to come up with this plan, which sought to overhaul the formula by which states or the public school districts get state money, because the formula really hasn't been working. Most school districts either they're guaranteed to get a certain amount of money, and whether the formula says they will or not, they're guaranteed by the state they're going to get that money, or the formula caps them, or the formula says they're supposed to get a huge amount of money and they're capped at how much they can get. So they're either on the guarantee or on the cap. 500 or so of the state's 600 school districts are either on the guarantee or on the cap. So that says the formula doesn't work. And everybody seems to agree on that part. But the question is how to fix it. And so throughout this process, Cupp and Patterson put together a formula, and I'm greatly oversimplifying it here, that would calculate what each school district would get in state money based on about 60% property values, 40% income in each district. So to try to come up with a formula that works for everybody. The problem is, of course, that it's going to cost a tremendous amount of money to put this thing into place. And so while it did pass the House overwhelmingly, because Representative Bob Cupp is now Speaker Bob Cupp,
Right.
so that really helps. And it has things in there that Democrats like, Republicans like. It passed overwhelmingly. There was applause after it passed.
Right, right.
Which, it's the first potentially constitutional school funding plan since 1997, when the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that school funding was unconstitutional. But then the funding that it would take to get to that point, that's what the Senate is concerned about. And so you have some senators who are saying they can't pass this plan because it would be almost another $2 billion on top of the $10 billion the state is already spending on public education. And so with that in mind, and with the economic situation that Ohio is facing because of this pandemic, this bill may not go very far.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because, as you said, this seemed to be a bipartisan effort that had some traction at first, but is caught up now in the financial, which is always the question with school funding. It always gets down to where's the money coming from. So it's, I guess, in one way, it's consistent with all the other efforts in the last 25 or 23 years. When you look at that, and you mentioned Bob Cupp, who is now the Speaker of the House, well respected, has held, I think, every office that you can hold in the state and been extremely successful and respected in all of them. He's dealing with the infamous House Bill 6, which is one of the ways, sort of how he evolved and became the Speaker this time. So a lot of people are wondering why there hasn't been more action on dealing with House Bill 6, which has underlying it this investigation about was there some malfeasance, some corruption, some bribery going on to get it passed in the form that it eventually passed. So talk a little bit about where that is in the legislature right now and what its prospects are to, because January 1st, people start seeing that fee attached to their electric bills.
Yeah, January 1st, a monthly fee of potentially $2.35 would come off every electric utility ratepayer's bill. It would be on that bill. And that's not just for First Energy customers, that's for everybody. And so House Bill 6 is, of course, the nuclear power plant bailout law that was passed last year in 2019. And it's not just that. It's a sweeping piece of energy legislation because it provides about $150 million in subsidies to Ohio's 2 nuclear power plants, but also about $20 million in subsidies to some solar projects, to 2 coal-fired power plants, including one that's not even in Ohio. And it also eliminates and makes major changes in the energy efficiency programs that utilities were running. And so it's a big piece of legislation. And that's part of why a repeal just isn't happening yet, because to repeal all of these moving parts and set everything back to where it was last year, that's potentially concerning for the utilities that have to put this into place. And of course, the 2 nuclear power plants say they can't afford to keep operating without subsidies. But this $61 million federal corruption case involving former Speaker Larry Householder, 4 other people, and a utility believed to be First Energy, the federal prosecutors say that group put together this scheme to get House Bill 6 passed. That is hanging over this whole thing. And so right now, what seems to be the possibility that's going to go forward here, as we're in this lame duck legislation or lame duck session of the legislature, where we're running out of time, there's a proposal from Representative Jim Hoops from Napoleon in Northwest Ohio that would delay the collection of that $2.35 monthly charge on everybody's bill for a year. And that way, he says, it gives everybody time to figure out what we want to keep from House Bill 6, what we want to get rid of from House Bill 6, but people aren't necessarily paying for that yet. Now, of course, the power plants say they've got a serious problem because they need the money.
Right.
So there's a big struggle back and forth over this massive piece of legislation, and we really are running out of time. There's no question about that.
Right, and again, the economic side of that is too that those power plants employ a lot of people, pay a lot of taxes, and so in those areas, and one of them is in Northwest Ohio, Davis-Besse, and the other one's over in Northeast Ohio, the Perry plant. There's that side of it too. So if you're a legislator who has one of those in your district or in your region, it's an economic issue too, because it means jobs and it means the economy not doing as well if those plants close. And it's just that, yeah, it's sitting there, and I think it's good that you talked about the other parts of it, because generally gets addressed as it's simply a bailout for the two power plants. But the reality is it has a lot of other pieces that are actually green in there to some degree in their effect. So it's not as simple as it sounds, as these things usually aren't. So that's it. We'll be back in just a moment. We've got a lot more things to talk about that are going on down in Columbus. We'll be back in just a moment with Karen Kasler here on The Journal. You're with us here on The Journal. Our guest is the host of the State of Ohio program, which is seen every Sunday here on WBGU, Karen Kasler. One of the issues that is a constant, I think, in any state house, it seems now, there's going to be a discussion of something regarding abortion and pro-life and things of that nature. And this legislature has been no different. It has moved some things through that the governor's been uncomfortable with at times. But right now there's another bill called the Fetal Remains Bill that deals with abortion in some aspects. So talk a little bit about that one as well, because that's one that's sort of under the radar only because of all these other issues that have dominated the news from down there.
Well, Governor Mike DeWine is potentially the most pro-life governor that Ohio has ever had, which is saying something, because, I mean, when you look at John Kasich and some of the pieces of legislation that he signed, he did, though, push back on things like the heartbeat bill, which DeWine signed last year, which immediately got challenged in court. This is another piece of legislation that people who've wanted to see this pass have been discussing for a long time. So when I tweeted out that this had passed, a lot of people responded by saying, this is what lawmakers are looking at during a pandemic. Well, this is something they've been looking at for a while. And this is a bill that would basically require that fetal remains from abortions, not from miscarriages, not from anything other than abortions, they be either buried or cremated. And so this is potentially, there are a couple other states that have similar laws. As I understand it, about 4 other states have similar laws. And in 3 of those states, the law has been challenged in court. So I can expect that once this piece of legislation goes back to the Senate for agreement on the changes the House made and goes to the governor is almost certainly going to sign this, that there would be a lawsuit attached to it. But it's one of those laws that have been happening in several different states to try to continually chip away a little bit at the whole issue of abortion. And this is something that's been a trend for quite a while. And it just comes at an interesting time, too, where quite often you're hearing in the debate about masks where people have been talking about my body, my choice. And yet that's the same thing that pro-choice people have always talked about in the abortion debate. So it's really kind of an interesting side of this whole, how people see what their ability is to do whatever they are doing. But certainly the legislature has been very strongly for measures like this that would really put further restrictions on abortion in Ohio.
Right, and that's been a continuing thing as well, not just in Ohio but around the country, as you mentioned. The governor obviously is in the middle of his term, or it has been. The legislature that's coming in on January 1st isn't going to look a lot different than the one that was up for election in November. So talk a little bit about what the future looks like in the next couple of years for the governor and the legislature, and is it going to be radically different than what we've seen the last couple of years from this particular legislature?
Well, in 2018, there was a little bit of a change. There was a net gain of 5 seats in the Ohio House by Democrats. And so with the polls that came out in 2020, there was really a thought that maybe that was going to change even more. The Democrats weren't going to take control of the House, and they will not take control of the Senate. There was no chance. The Senate has been controlled by Republicans since the 80s. So there was a question about whether Democrats might gain some strength. Well, of course, that turned out to be wrong. Donald Trump apparently won Ohio, well, according to certified results, won Ohio by just slightly less than he did in 2016. And that carried over with Republicans as well. Republicans ended up gaining 3 seats in the House and 1 in the Senate. Democrats gained a seat in the House. They flipped a seat in Westlake, which is in suburban Cleveland. But yeah, you're right. It's going to be almost the same composition in terms of the legislature, slightly more Republican than even it is today. And so that, of course, gives DeWine certain abilities as governor to pass some of the things he might want to pass, but of course the same challenges remain. To try to get any sort of legislation on guns passed, that seems really unlikely. To have this continuing battle back and forth over the authority a governor has with public health orders and the questions about masks and how masks have become so political, those questions will still remain in the next session of the legislature because the composition is really about the same. What is interesting, though, is to see that the Supreme Court has changed, and pretty dramatically, I'd argue, in the last couple of years. There are now 3 Democrats, or there will be, on the Ohio Supreme Court, when just a couple of years ago, there were virtually no Democrats. There was Bill O'Neill was the only Democrat. And so that kind of makes it very interesting, especially as the legislature has to come together and draw a congressional map. And Ohio may indeed lose a congressional district seat in this particular census. And so if they have to draw the map where it's not 16 members of Congress, it's 15, how do you figure out which party loses a seat?
Which means, and that whole process has been subject to, has always been political in nature. There have been efforts to not have it be political, but those have been a little tricky. We've got about 30 seconds. Is there one thing that people should be watching in Columbus that's going to pop up after the first of the year, other than the things we've talked about, that something new that somebody, a legislator or the governor might decide to move in this session coming up?
I don't think so. I think the priority is still going to be COVID and what's going to be happening with the numbers. I think there's a real concern about what happened over Thanksgiving carrying over into Christmas as these numbers continue to rise. And so, the governor's warned that he might be forced to do things that he doesn't want to do. For instance, shut down bars and restaurants. That's a real concern, I think, and there would certainly be a lot of pushback on that.
Right. Well, Karen Kasler, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us about what's going on in Columbus. Appreciate that, and of course, appreciate your work on the state of Ohio every week here on the PBS stations around the state. You can check us out at WBGU.org, and of course, you can watch us each week on The Journal here on WBGU. We'll see you again next time on The Journal.